If I am wiggling around a little bit, my back and my shoulders are absolutely killing me, so please forgive me wiggling like a madman. Hey, hi, hello, how you doing? Today I wanted to talk about a topic that is incredibly important when you are learning how to write a book, which is how to write emotion. Many writers struggle to accurately and properly write and convey emotion when they first start learning how to write a book. It isn't necessarily something that as a baby writer you think about. You start thinking about how to write an interesting plot and how to properly convey a big explosion. As in a building blowing up, not an explosion as in my character is going through some stuff right now. Character emotion is just as important as plot, world building, or any other aspect of your writing journey and the way that you write books. Your character's actions are often driven by their emotions rather than logic. We as people in general are very much controlled by our emotions, how we are feeling in the moment, and how we decide to act on our emotions. We are often more led by emotions than logic. This is why it is also incredibly important to know how to write emotion in the first place. So today I have 4 tips on how to write and properly convey emotion in your writing. So the number one thing that you want to look into when you are writing emotion is to be specific. So we all know the 6 base emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. These are our 6 base emotions, and when we verbalize our emotions, these are usually the emotions that we name. I am happy, I am sad, I am scared. But these are really more categories that we can put our actual emotions into if we were to organize our emotions into some big diagram. So what specifically do I mean by that? Let's look at the emotion of sadness. You never just feel sad. Most of the time you feel sorrowful, regretful, depressed, gloomy, grief, heartache, disappointment, as well as a bunch of other emotions that you could be feeling in the moment. With fear, it's often not just fear, but more specifically panic, fright, nervousness, apprehension, anxiety, worry, or dread. To purely use the base definitions of happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise puts us in boxes when describing our emotions that don't necessarily fit. It's like trying to fit a circle into a square. To identify the specific emotion that we are feeling, we can more easily understand what our character is going through and relate to them better. Not being specific leads us to not be able to describe the exact emotion that the character is feeling, therefore leaving it incomplete. If we describe depression versus being gloomy, we're going to have 2 different descriptions, 2 different ways of describing this. Therefore, it also helps us to place a specific emotion with this specific incident. It also tells us more about how specifically a character is going to react to a certain situation. That is why when you're in therapy and you say, oh, it made me sad, a therapist might continue asking questions as to what kind of sadness, because it helps people to understand you and your very specific reaction. We as authors need that as much as a therapist might need that for a client. Even if the question of, and how did that make you feel, can get very much under your skin. Another important thing to note when it comes to specifying the emotion is not only what the character is feeling, but how it presents. Our brain has a flash second in how to decide to deal with an emotion. what we are going to do once we feel it, and how we're going to show it. Now, in some situations, we might not feel that it is safe to show a certain emotion, whether that be because it is simply not appropriate, like we are feeling sad in a room where everyone is happy after getting a certain news, or we are just in an environment where it would be genuinely dangerous for us to show a certain emotion. This is when we might start masking. We feel sad, but we display happiness. This is a decision process that our brain goes through each and every time that we feel a new emotion or we go into a different environment. What am I feeling? How do I want to respond to it? And is it safe to do so? Our brain always looks out for our safety. And if we do not feel that it is safe to display a certain emotion, we will start masking. No, this is not just specifically for people who have a condition like autism, ADD, or ADHD, while it is more common because their emotions and the way that they show it might be more frowned upon. Everyone masks to a certain degree. People with PTSD might also be more likely to mask. And there is a good chance that your main character, at least throughout the course of the story, is going to develop some kind of trauma and thus PTSD. I'm just pointing it out. I'm just putting that out there. Anger specifically might be a harder emotion to write and be specific with. And the reason for that is that anger often hides other emotions that we are feeling. It is very rare to only feel anger in a certain situation. You know how there are those pictures online of like icebergs of like this is what you see and this is what's underneath? Anger is a very good example of that. And if you type it on the internet, anger iceberg, you might see exactly what I mean. Anger often hides multiple forms of sadness, multiple forms of fear, disappointment, regret, annoyance, insecurities, feelings of guilt, remorse, embarrassment, shame. And oftentimes a person, and thus a character, will use anger to have to avoid dealing with the emotion that they are actually feeling. That actual emotion might be too scary to deal with or too overwhelming. So instead, the brain first gets angry at the fact that it can't deal with this specific emotion that it's actually feeling because it's too overwhelming. That then turns into internalized anger. And because we don't want to deal with internalized anger, we turn it external instead. And that is where we see anger. So when you're writing anger, you're also going to have to start identifying the emotions that come along with anger. Why are we showing this anger? What is the emotion that is underneath? And why are we scared of dealing with it? You truly are going to have to play a psychologist when it comes to describing anger. Oftentimes when we feel angry, we aren't even aware that there is an emotion underneath. But when you, as the author, are writing anger from someone else's point of view, you have to understand the whole process behind it in order to understand it properly. You also have to be specific in how many emotions the character is feeling. We often feel multiple emotions at the same time, especially if we have multiple perspectives on one situation. Sadness and happiness oftentimes can go together. Anger and fear oftentimes go together. Heartache and disappointment are another two that you will often see together. Heartache and regret. Nervousness and panic. So if you can identify a character is happy but sad at the same time, you have to identify which type of happy, which type of sadness, and in which way do they both show so that they can coexist at the same time. The second part of writing emotions accurately comes from the concept of show versus tell. A new writer might not know the concept of show versus tell. So let me give a really quick definition of what it is. Showing is about using description and action to help the reader experience the story. Telling is when the author summarizes or uses exposition to simply tell the reader what is happening. This is a quote from Autocrit Online Editing. In most situations, you're gonna have to show. Like saying a house is creepy is telling. Describing exactly what makes it creepy without using the actual word creepy is showing. It is much more detailed and leaves a much more vivid image in the head of a reader. That's the simple explanation of it, but if I wanted to describe that more, I'd have to do a whole video on it. So with emotion, you want to use show as much as possible, especially when the character isn't naming their emotion through dialogue. You're gonna have to most likely use show. A character through dialogue is usually going to keep it very simple, saying I'm angry, I'm sad, blah blah blah, using the 6 base emotions usually, or they might use something like I'm frustrated, I'm disappointed, but they're gonna use the actual word. Unless a situation like that, you're rarely going to find a situation where you can easily just use the word. You're gonna have to show. To give some basic examples, you can say that the character's legs started trembling. Their throat is closing up. Their heart sank to the floor. They had to turn their head away because they couldn't continue to look at the sight in front of them. They had tears stinging behind their eyes. Longer descriptions give more of an opportunity to properly convey emotion in a detailed manner. This would be done show. When you simply say that the character is mad, frustrated, it's not really specific because there are so many ways that one single emotion can feel and show itself depending on the context. So showing their exact external reaction as well as their internal reaction to the feeling can be much more beneficial to both you as the author and the reader trying to grasp the situation that the character is currently in. It also makes the reader much more empathetic because they can more clearly understand what the character is going through. If we have had the same emotional reaction to a feeling, it's gonna evoke empathy. If we have felt before that our heart sunk to our feet, and a reader reads that, they're gonna be like, I know exactly how that feels. Therefore, they can imagine it better. No emotion shows the same for everybody. So therefore, saying I'm angry, I'm scared, I'm hurt isn't always going to work unless it is in very specific circumstances. The third important part on writing emotion is identifying the trigger. Emotions come from a certain trigger. This is the why of why are you feeling this emotion. If you were to specifically ask your character, why are you feeling this way? The answer that they give is your why. What is the situation that triggered them? Why are they feeling the way that they are? This is going to help you both describe exactly what they are feeling, as well as determine the action that is going to follow this emotion, which you also later on have to identify. But again, we're going to be talking about that in a minute. The trigger also heavily influences the intensity of the emotion that we are feeling. If the trigger is something that is more personal, our emotions tend to be much more heavy than if the trigger is impersonal. Like hearing something on the news, while it might make us sad, maybe a bit gloomy, it is not the same as when we hear that something horrible has happened to a person that we love and care about. From there, the emotion might go from feeling a bit gloomy to straight up depressed. It's the same with any other type of emotion. The bigger the trigger, the bigger the reaction is to the trigger. Thus, the bigger our emotion. Find your character's why. There are multiple things that you can look at. There are their surroundings, other characters that are currently around that could be influencing their mental state, as well as the character's emotional state before this particular trigger that caused their current set of emotions. If the character was already feeling tired, let's say that they had a bad night's sleep, and then something happens that would normally make them feel frustrated, they might now be straight up pissed off. They might not be able to hide that emotion because of the fact that they were already tired. If we are extremely happy because of some good news that we have received, let's say this is something that we have been waiting for a very, very long time, and then we get bad news, the scales start off differently. Therefore, the impact of this negative news is also going to be different. If our current emotions, our happiness scale is currently at 10, and the sad news that we receive takes off 4 points, we're still at 6. If our emotional state, our happiness scale was at 6, and the sad news, again, takes off 4 points, we're now feeling at a 2. We're feeling much worse than if we had started off feeling better before this news came in. However, this might also not influence it as much if this is big news that eradicates any emotion that the character was feeling beforehand. Let's say that before the character was really happy, they were having a great day, but the news that they get is so upsetting, it might get rid of that happiness entirely and purely replace it by, for example, anger and everything that is below that. If the trigger is something more personal to the character, again with the example of someone that they personally know and care about is really hurt, it might also influence their actions. They might decide to be more proactive rather than just deal with the emotions internally, which is where we arrive at my very last point for this video, which is coping mechanisms. With emotions, we go through a certain process, and to put that process really simply, we have the trigger, the internal reaction, which is our emotion, and our external reaction, which is the action that we take in response to feeling this emotion. This is often a process that our brain goes through in seconds. We often don't have longer than that, especially if we are feeling emotions around other people. That adds a certain amount of pressure to act on this emotion. Our brain's 2 priorities when we are feeling an emotion is our emotional safety as well as regulating. We have to regulate when we feel an emotion in order to prevent getting overwhelmed. Our emotions come on a scale from very light to very extreme. Again, this is where emotional overwhelm comes in. This is when we're angry when we get physical or start throwing with things or crying. Or when we are experiencing anxiety on such an extreme level that we shoot into a panic attack. People reach overwhelm at different points, meaning that when one character is feeling the exact same type of emotion as well as the same amount of intensity, they might still be able to deal with it in a healthy way, while another character might get completely overwhelmed. They might break down, cry, scream, panic attack, or if they are incredibly happy, they might not be able to just contain that happiness to a smile anymore. There is such a thing as positive overwhelm, as much as there is negative overwhelm. Regulation goes from trying to control the emotion to a healthy level to, if it is a emotion that we don't want to feel at all, trying to get rid of it and replace it with a positive emotion, like trying to replace anxiety with happiness. In order to try to regulate these emotions, we have different coping mechanisms. Now, coping mechanisms can come both in healthy ways and unhealthy ways. Whether we choose a healthy coping mechanism or an unhealthy one can depend on multiple different things. How well does a character already know how to regulate? How good are they at regulating their own emotions? This is usually based on experience that they have had in the past, because we might think like, oh yeah, if I'm in that situation, I can definitely regulate myself, and in reality, that might be a completely different outcome, a completely different situation where we really don't know how to regulate. So try to go off of past experiences that you know that this character might have had. Which coping mechanisms, which strategies have they found helpful in the past? How self-aware is the character? This is coming back to, can they see that in this type of situation they would react healthily or not? Or if they were to mentally put themselves in that scenario of what if this happened to me, how correctly can they guess how they would react? How in tune are they with their emotions? Which just means how easily can they identify the emotion that they are feeling. There are also conditions like autism that can make it harder for a person to recognize the emotion that they are feeling, as well as the fact they might be able to identify that they are sad, but can they identify which kind of sadness? How intense is the emotion? Again, is it still at a level where they can deal with it healthily, or are they completely overwhelmed? As well as, are they in a situation, an environment where they are able to regulate? Not every situation gives us the opportunity to regulate in the way that we need to achieve an ideal result. When we are alone and there aren't any other people there that we have to look at or feel the need to make them feel comfortable, we can often more easily regulate. If we are surrounded by a lot of people, we might not do that as well. We might feel the need to look at them and their comfort level, and that then might change how we cope with the situation. As well as, would it just be safe in general to show our emotions, show that we are overwhelmed, show that we are sad, mad, frustrated, disappointed, heartbroken? Because there are people out there who do not always make that a safe environment. The simple example, the villain of the story. Unless they turn into the love interest, I guess. I guess there's your exception to that, but I don't write that kind of stuff, so there, like I said, are healthy ways to cope and unhealthy ways to cope. Once you've identified whether this is a situation that your character would be able to deal with and regulate healthily, you're gonna have to decide exactly how they choose to act. Unhealthy coping mechanisms can look like overspending, overeating or undereating, like an eating disorder. It can be overreacting, choosing to get violent, choosing to yell, choosing to scream, to break down and cry, but not really with the idea of I'm gonna get my emotions out so that I can act. It's more the idea of I feel so helpless, I can't do anything, so I have to cry. In extreme cases, it can look like the person hurting themselves, sleeping too much, not sleeping enough, isolating, avoiding, dissociating, derealizing. These are all solutions that, while they feel good in the moment because they bring immediate relief, in the long term are very harmful. They cause us to go down a spiral that is very hard to get out of. Healthy coping mechanisms often are, while they might be more frustrating sometimes in the moment, more helpful long term. It helps us to healthily deal with emotions that are better for us looking into the future. While it might feel better to yell and scream and cry when we're angry, that would be a negative coping mechanism, an unhealthy coping mechanism. A healthy coping mechanism might be to say, I'm getting really upset, I need to leave and take a moment to breathe. That is a healthy coping mechanism. The frustrating part is that, frankly, it would just be more satisfying to yell in someone's face. What makes it healthy is that afterwards you can say, I didn't go off, I didn't say anything that I now regret. I'm not now struggling with emotions of guilt, of embarrassment, of regret, and my anger has gone down. And that makes it a healthy coping mechanism. Unhealthy coping mechanisms, again, to come back to the example of the screaming and the crying, might leave you with regret, guilt, and you might have said some things that you can never take back. Healthy coping mechanisms can come in 5 different forms. There is problem-focused coping, which is direct actions to deal with the problem at hand. Emotional focused coping, which comes more at dealing with the internal emotions and sensations. Social support, which looks like going to other people for emotional support and advice. Meaning making, which essentially means that you are trying to cope by giving the situation a meaning that might bring you more comfort. Like saying, yes, this sucks that this really happened, but the fact that this is happening because of this reason gives me a sense of comfort. As well as religious coping. This is very specific to people who have a religion, whether you are Christian, Jewish, Islam, or pagan. Me, who is a pagan. They might try to find comfort through their religion. These are all ways of coping that help you also towards the future as well as in the present moment. We use these in everyday life, and your character is also going to be using these throughout the course of the book if they are choosing to deal with a situation healthily. Sometimes the two can intermingle, where a coping mechanism isn't healthy but can't be classified as unhealthy either, in the sense that it's still bad but not catastrophic. There are probably better ways to deal with things, but you can still move on from the fact that you chose not to go with something different. Every character is going to deal with situations differently. A way that you might get some examples of this is if you present the same scenario to 5 people in everyday life and ask them, how would you deal with this? And present them with these 5 categories of healthy coping mechanisms, saying, which one would you choose if you were in that situation? Different situations also require different coping mechanisms, so just because your character one time chooses to focus on something that is more directly problem solving doesn't mean that they will do so every time. Think of how you have dealt with emotions in different ways in the past. Your character is going to be doing the same thing depending on the situation and what they might need in the moment. A character might also choose to avoid a certain type of coping altogether. If your character is someone who isn't very trusting of other people, they're probably not going to seek out other people in vulnerable moments. Unless the other character finds them somewhere and forces it on them, for example. There will be a link in the description box specifically for these types of coping mechanisms with just some more information on them. At the end of the day, writing emotions is tough. And just a few tips from a random stranger on the internet is not going to teach you exactly how to do it. It's not just purely your skill that is going to determine how well you write emotion. It's also how well you know the character, how well you know the project, how many drafts you've written of it. The amount of emotion and the way that I describe it in a final draft is very different than how I do it in the first draft. It doesn't have to be perfect the moment that you have to put the emotion down on paper. It takes practice, it takes showing up, it takes years of honing your craft. So when you sit down at your desk next time and it still doesn't go perfectly, you're not a bad writer. You're just learning. And writing emotions, frankly, is, in my opinion, sometimes one of the hardest parts of the writing process. Now, I hope that this video was helpful and that you got some useful tips out of it. I make new videos every single week with tips on how to become a better writer. So if you are interested in that, please subscribe to my channel. I hope you liked the video. I hope that it was helpful. And I hope that I will see you in another video. Bye-bye.